Let's continue with our ongoing focus around the inquest into the death of anti-apartheid activist Chief Albert Luthuli, which commenced this week in the High Court in Pietermaritzburg. The NPA, in fact, deciding to open the inquest into Luthuli's death and that of human rights lawyer Griffiths Mxenge. Now, Luthuli, who advocated for equal rights amongst all race groups in South Africa, died back in July of 1967. But of course, there's always been questions around the circumstances surrounding his death. It's an opportunity for us to reflect on this process and perhaps the more wider questions that it presents. And for that, let's bring in our guest. Advocate Sipho Mantula is a researcher with the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs and joins us now via our video link. Advocate, it's lovely to see you. Thanks for your time and indeed your patience, especially when it comes to ventilating these important issues. In many ways, of course, what is happening as a result of this process is we're being forced to take a couple steps back to what it took to bring this country to where it is. And I wonder whether you are optimistic that given the time that has passed, we are able to finally make sure that there is that closure and peace for the families of these two great figures who've always had questions around how they died.
Good morning even to your viewers. Indeed, looking back at 32 years of our freedom, human rights, democracy, it is very important to always reflect and look back at the political crimes that were being committed by the apartheid government, particularly towards the liberation movements, whether the ANC, PAC, AZAPO, they've been calling for this inquest. You will recall, Ayanda, that this inquest of Nkosi Albert Luthuli, Griffiths Mxenge, and many more, whether it's Mashinini, and even one can include the one of even Krisani. One looks at that this has been the call from families, this has been the call from the National Prosecuting Authority. Remember, Ayanda, for an inquest to be held or to be engaged, there has to be a two process, the minister as well as the National Director of Public Prosecution to engage on the new evidence. But that shows also, Ayanda, that whatever the Truth and Reconciliation Commission files have been pointing us to can say that both the law enforcement agencies and as well as the judiciary, they've been colluding in many political assassinations in this country. And considering the stature, the character of Nkosi Albert Luthuli, it is also a very sad moment also for the family to be going through this, Ayanda. Despite that, for them, it is also part of healing as part of closure. But for them to always be on the stand narrating what happened from 1967 until today, that is a sad moment. But at the same time, like I've said, it's a victory in terms of transitional justice system to can say that finally there are some light or there is some evidence that is coming to link the apartheid government as well as the poor judgment that was done by Magistrate Boswell. Because if you look here, and again, you look at the role of the courts during that time, you look at the role of how the Inquest Act of 1959 was used, and now post-1994, how we were able to amend Section 17A so that families of Griffiths Mxenge, families of Luthuli and many more others can use that Section 17 to pursue on those unfinished businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll speak in just a moment about what real justice looks like on the other side of this process. But you've mentioned the TRC, and I'll be honest, a big part of my personal interest was around how a process like this forces us to reflect on the legacy of that commission. I mean, it wasn't a process without its flaws. In fact, there are many still today who believe that it left many families grasping for closure and for true justice. What's your thinking around, how we should then reflect upon what was meant to be done by the TRC given the reopening of these inquests?
And I think it is never too late. You will understand that we have the family of the Kalata. I mean, we have many families early this year. They were calling for the for the probe, actually, for the investigation to say, was the TRC also politicized? Was there any political influence? And I think also for the TRC, it is a matter of looking at, during that period of 1995, 96, transition, I think we did rush, and I think there was no need for us to have rushed for that process, despite that we knew that there were many victims, there were many survivors of apartheid, and as we know, the issue of capacity within NPA, because such cases also falls under priority investigation units. Some of the cases, they fall under, one can say, the SABC, the crime intelligence, to look at such cases. And it is very important to always reflect, as we are doing the 30 years of our freedom and democracy, that we should also hold the institutions that were supposed to have assisted families accountable, and also try to reboot the system, capacitate the NPA. As I know, one of the issues that was raised by the Ms. Shamila Patoi at some point, if you can recall, was that the TRC matters have the challenge in terms of not only the evidence that is missing, but also the capacity, having many investigators to deal with such cases. And I think that's where we see the role of the media being very critical, to be the ones who are also exposing such files of the TRC that were never being dealt with, and also our NPA to start to investigate such cases, because families are in all these cases, they remain at the center. Communities also, hence we see in this case of Albert Luthuli, the role of the museum becomes important when we are talking of archives and we're talking of evidence. And that's where also the issues around how do we capacitate even the NPA, and I'm still insisting on that, but the role of universities also looking at the transitional justice, looking at human rights systems. How do we also look at the family? Will the family look at this matter only for an inquest? What about reparation to the families who have lost their loved ones?
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we speak about the ANC in all of this? I mean, we saw at the beginning of the week when this inquest started, a few of the party's prominent leaders present there, and it's obvious why. I mean, Albert Luthuli was a prominent leader of the party. But it also comes at a time where, let's face it, the ANC is, I think, forced to grapple with its own legacy. You know, perhaps last year's elections have made this feel a whole lot more relevant than it otherwise would have. Where do you reckon this places the ANC as it tries to, I suppose, consolidate the role it's played in our own liberation, and, you know, how that story has been told over the years?
No, definitely you could see that the ANC had to dispatch their high-level members, but also remember that some of those members, they are from KwaZulu-Natal, and they've been holding this view that there was a political assassination to some of its leaders, looking at the period of 1967, looking at the human rights lawyer 1981. But like you said, it is part of the heritage and the history of the ANC. There is no way they can run away from documenting it and following it and supporting the family, because what I can pick up here, and it is not political expediency or political posturing by the ANC. I think for them, it is also for the issue to can restore the dignity to the family, restore also the heritage and the dignity of the former ANC president, because here we are talking of the ANC president, we are talking of the human rights lawyer who was representing both the ANC and other liberation movements, including PAC. So it is very important, that when you have to look at the current challenges, yes, that are facing the governing party or the co-governing party, they have to restore, they have to reclaim their heritage. And it is for the benefit of the present generation to understand what has happened to the founding presidents of the ANC, to the members of the ANC who have contributed in the struggle of this country, because it is all about restoration again, restorative justice, and hence I'm saying that I don't think for the ANC they should use it as a political mileage for the 2026 local government elections, or like you have said earlier, the 2024 elections, what has happened, maybe as a part of restoring their image. But I think this one, it is all about dignity, it is all about humanity, it is also about the heritage of the African National Congress.
No, fair enough. You've mentioned the term transitional justice quite a few times. I wonder if you can break that term down for us, Advocate. And as you do that, help us understand what you reckon justice looks like on the other side of this process.
You know, when we talk of transitional justice, it is the TRC processes. That TRC processes will include the investigation, will include reparation, will include amnesty. And people who should have come forward to apply for amnesty, remember when you look at the case of Griffiths Mxenge, there was no clarity about his death, but people came before TRC, confessed that we were part of the assassination of this human rights lawyer. So the transitional justice mechanisms, it is all about restorative justice, but also it is all about acknowledgement by those perpetrators and for the family to find closure. And that closure, it is not just accepting apology. It is the issue of how do you restore and how do you go to the status quo, because Albert Luthuli, Albert Mxenge, there were fathers, there were grandfathers to their families, there were leaders in their own right. So the question of transitional justice, and it's an international law principle, but in our country post-1994, we could not grasp with it very well. Hence, I raised the question I was lamenting earlier, that why was there a hurry? Why did we rush to close the TRC matters when today, me and you, and I can tell you, we'll only talk about 20,000 victims of apartheid, when we know very well that there were many people who suffered during apartheid. And hence today, we find other races, they go to the US and talk about genocide, when actually apartheid was a crime against humanity. And that's how it is very important for us to know that the mechanism of transitional justice is to always benefit the families, to always benefit the survivors and the victims. And in some instances, justice must be seen, justice must not be delayed. And what we saw in this case of Ubaba Nkosi, Albert Luthuli, it was a miscarriage of justice, because here we see a judge, an investigator colluding to lie and talk about the same old story that we have known about political leaders committing suicide, hanging themselves, falling from the buildings. We have known those narratives or those alibis that have been framed by the apartheid government. But I think in this era, Ayanda and some of us living in this time, it will be important for the children to know the truth, because once we talk about truth, once we talk about justice, it should be done in a fair and an open manner.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in moments like this that we're reminded just how young this democracy is. I mean, people who were personally affected by what took place are still alive. And in many ways, we understand that one of Luthuli's own daughters is going to take to the stand. So we'll certainly be watching that story very closely. Advocate Sipho Mantula, always a pleasure. Thanks indeed for speaking to us. Advocate Mantula is with the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Relations.